my job as to build the best possible team. And I do that by hiring people who are a lot better than me and a lot smarter than me into roles that are clearly defined. And then I stay out of their way. And my job is really about knocking down barriers for them and ensuring they have as much road to run as possible. And then, don't try and hold them back. Try and let them fly. Let them rip.
Welcome to The Next Moves. My name's Joe Diubaldo, and for the past 25 years, I've been helping people build careers and build amazing companies. And the truth I've learned is that we all get stuck at different times. And I want to help you get unstuck, plan your next move and the move after that. And I think the best way to do that is to look at the choices that some of our guests had in front of them and the moves that they made. Let's take a listen. So Michael, I want to take it back to the beginning and ask you what it was like growing up in Los Angeles and what shaped your early interests.
As I said, grew up in LA, went to Boston in college, then from there to graduate school in the UK, predominantly to take a year off between finishing college and supposedly going to medical school. As the oldest son of an immigrant family, medical school was something I was supposed to do. I was not convinced, which is why I kept moving further and further east from home. And ultimately, I fell into a lab at the University of Sussex on the south coast of England, who had some very well-known chemists. And I really enjoyed my work. I originally went thinking I would work for a couple months, make money, then go travel until I ran out of money and then redo. And the professor said the work bit was fine. You could skip the travel. But I loved the work, and I loved being in the lab. And what really caught my imagination was being a chemical cook and getting away from the theoretical parts of chemistry and really rolling your sleeves up, getting on the bench and making things. But in the lab, we were working with a highly pyrophoric, just very difficult chemistry, and I loved it. Just absolutely loved it. But when I finished my PhD in 1989, I really, you're at a crossroads when you finish a PhD. You need to decide whether you want to go into academia or you want to go into industry. And academia, you would then go on to a postdoc. And I was absolutely not interested in that. I always knew I was interested in business. I didn't know why. I had no reference for business, but I was just excited about the idea of business. So I went and started my career in the UK at ICI, which was Imperial Chemical Industries, one of the top 5 chemical companies in the world at the time. And I started really in research at ICI in 1989, but immediately put my head above the parapet and said, look, I joined here because you said I could move into any area. I want to go onto the commercial side. And I really bugged them. And then finally, they offered me a way onto the commercial side, which was to join a division that was being spun out through a management buyout by a US-led private equity firm. And I left in 91 and was given an opportunity, the CEO of that company, to move from research, from a technical role into a fully commercial role, which was quite unusual. But I had to do it from the ground up. So I literally started in 1991 on the sales desk selling chemicals for 6 months over the phone. I then went, I learned the basics of the industry, the basics of the business. And then after 6 months, went out on the road with direct account selling, and then eventually was a territory manager looking after the Nordic area, which is Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, which was, for a young man, was pretty exciting. Absolutely beautiful places. I remember and you remember this, Joe, but this is before you had a cell phone, an iPhone that told you where to go. You had things called maps, and there was no real internet to find stuff. You had to call helplines. And I remember, I'll never forget the day that I had to go from Manchester, England to a client meeting in Malmo on the south coast of Sweden. And I was so excited that I actually made it to the customer. I forget the customer, I forget what we did, but the fact that I just made it there, all I had was an address, I thought was quite amazing. I flew to Copenhagen, rented a car, drove up to the coast, got on a ferry, went across the ferry, drove down, and then ended up at the customer. that's sort of how I started my career. And, from really humble commercial beginnings, learning the basics of the industry, getting paid very, very little, but given an opportunity to grow. And I really acting as a sponge, learning as much as I could, traveling as aggressively as I could. Eventually moved up in that business to where in '96 I was running two of their five business units and was participating in an IPO of that company on the London Stock Exchange, which was exciting, and got my taste for making a little bit of money through equity. And then decided it was time. The company was still pretty new, had been bought, and this division had been taken out from ICI. We had successfully restructured it to the point where we could float it on the stock exchange. But I was as senior as I was going to get for a young man, and I was in my early 30s, and was offered a job outside the company as a main board commercial director of another private equity backed chemical company, a plastics compounder called Colloids. We're making a color concentrator master batch. And I joined as a main board director responsible for commercial activity in a turnaround situation. And it was exciting. But it was difficult. We were in Northwest England. It was a heavily unionized shop. I came in as the naive young American, full of excitement and ready to pump people up and let's go, and trying to change things. And I was getting the windows broken on my car and all sorts of fun stuff. It was, I did that for 3 years. We did turn it around, but it was difficult. But it did give me some perspective on some heavily unionized areas.
Michael, can I ask a question? I want to, there's like a couple of inflection points. Like, you've come from a family of immigrants, and moving into a profession feels like the thing that everyone wants you to do. And if you look at your parents, your father was a surgeon, your mom was a lawyer, and it's almost as though, what is this idea called business? And I had the same challenge, which is no one knows what it is. But what was the idea of, like, why was there a fascination with business? And how did you manage that, as strange as it sounds, with your parents, to explain to them, like, this is what I want to do?
It's a really good question. I don't know where it came from, but it was something inside me that I just felt I needed to explore. And, when I look back at, the path I took, the classes I took in college, they're all aimed at getting me to medical school and into that profession. And if I did it again, I wouldn't do that. I would take things like economics and all the business stuff, but I don't regret it at all, because it gives you a framework. It gave me a base on which to launch, a little bit of an unusual career. It gives you a framework for thinking and breaking problems down. And then my career, my 35-year commercial career, Joe, has all been in advanced materials, semiconductor materials, chemistry related. So although I'm not an expert in anything, I can ask a lot of stupid questions, which ultimately make some sense, and I can understand generally what's going on in the businesses I operate on or in. But to your point, your question about my parents, they just had no reference. They were always, look, you got to be your own boss. And the whole idea of working for a corporation seems crazy. You need to control your future. And they just didn't get it. And there was no reference in the family. There was no one who was in business in the family. So it was scary.
I look at this and I think about, you've had this moment where you're selling your parents on one thing, or at least telling them that this is what you're going to do. And then the next one is you're selling someone on the idea that you want to move from the technical side into commercialization. So was that second time a multi-month process, or were you able to actually explain to them, here's why I should be here and this is what I want? And how did you actually get that transition? Because it's not normal, or I should say it's not normal. It's not, you don't see it as often as you would expect when people become experts in a domain.
I knew I wanted to go onto the transition the moment I accepted the job. And I had applied to two jobs, one at Unilever, one at ICI. I got both jobs. And the reason I went with ICI was they offered me a route. They basically said, look, you're going to be a graduate on our fast track program. You can go anywhere you want. And so I literally joined, sat in and said, okay, I now want to transfer out. And this was in the UK, 1989, 1990, the country had fallen into a big recession. Those promises made were not promises kept at the time. And the senior folks said, whoa, 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 hang on, we're cutting people, just be patient. And you've known me for a little while, I'm not the most patient person you'll ever meet. So I knew I wanted to move. I knew I didn't want to be in R&D. I joined this company because they offered me a move.
So you've actually taken a crack at building a marketplace for intellectual property as well.
Mm-hmm.
I actually want to run some of these accomplishments because they're impressive. So what was that business in a brief description? What would you call it?
It was literally a marketplace for intellectual property. Exactly what you say. We created a market where mainly large corporations could buy and sell confidential intellectual property in a safe way. And the business was premised. This was a business called yet2.com. Business was premised on the fact that if you look at corporations across the world, the majority, who spend billions and billions of dollars a year on R&D, the majority of that R&D does not get commercialized. It sits on the shelf, and technology has a time value component, meaning it's not like a fine wine that improves with time. It decreases in value over time. And typically, an organization, the majority of their revenue will come from 10% of their innovation, 10% of their IP, whether they bought it in or invented it themselves. So the other 90% sits on the shelf and ages. And can you imagine a business where if you could start licensing that technology and getting additional revenue in, that revenue, by the way, you've already invested in this technology, that revenue drops straight to the bottom line as 99% profit margin. So, if you look at some of the big businesses that are successful, Qualcomm is all about licensing revenue. Philips in the Netherlands built a tremendous model on licensing revenue. And it's a nice thing to do. So the problem, though, is that companies don't know how to connect and make non-intuitive connections. Ford doesn't need a company to introduce them to GM or to Stellantis. They know each other. They're in the same thing. But Ford maybe needs somebody to help get them into Roche Pharmaceuticals out of Basel, Switzerland. They're just different and they speak a different language. So how can you create a common language and a platform that allows these companies to connect and in a non-competitive way solve each other's problems and make a bit of money? So that was exciting. We did that in 1999. Then I was instrumental in selling that business in Christmas 2002. That I then exited with the sale.
So you moved from there, and let's talk about, is it Nanoco? Is that how I say it?
Well, first in between Yet2 and Nanoco, I was consulting for a company called Exatec, which was a GE Bayer joint venture. And I was taking all the licensing skills I'd learned in the previous company and using them to help this company, Bayer GE, out-license some polycarbonate processing technology that they had, which was a lot of fun. And then I then was introduced to my co-founder at Nanoco by some VCs who were interested in investing, but they were looking for someone to help the technical guy, run the business. And that was end of 2004. So I joined my partner at the time, Nigel Pickett, who was the co-founder and CTO.
So Michael, you've had a partnership in your life where you worked directly. You were a co-founder with someone else. You built this company, and effectively the output is everywhere around us with Samsung in their QLED technology. So what's the story of Nanoco, and how did this partnership get formed? I'm curious why it worked.
Nanoco, I was introduced to Nigel Pickett, who's the CTO of Nanoco. And I was introduced by some VCs who were interested in the company. The company were interested in him and his technology. He had tried to raise money, had done it. It had not been successful. And so I liked him personally. I was excited about the technology. This was 2004, and we really had no idea what the technology was going to be used for. Basically, you could create these fluorescent semiconductors to create very bright monochromatic, it's very pure red, green, yellow, orange, blue, purple light, and you can infinitely tune the shade of light. So a small amount of energy in gave you a very bright light back. And I thought, well, I don't know what we're going to use this for, but my gut tells me it could be really valuable. this could be really interesting. So I joined in September 2004, and the deal was I wasn't going to draw a salary until we raised money. So joined, we set up the company, and the deal I had with Nigel was he was just going to focus on the technology. That's it. Get the tech to work. And I would do everything else. I would make sure he got paid, people got paid, we had place to do the science. That was our deal. That was our deal until I left. He stayed focused on what he was brilliant at, and I stayed focused on building the business based on his brilliant technology. And he delivered in spades, and we were able to take this platform of technology and take it to Asia and built relationships with the largest tech companies in the world, including Samsung, who we started working with in 2006. And they started incorporating our technology in the next generation TVs, which were finally launched in 2015 at the Las Vegas Consumer Electronics Show. And by then, we knew we had something. We had done a huge licensing deal with Dow Chemical. Because when you're a little company, you try to figure out you have to scale up. And scaling can be very challenging, and many companies fall over. And the other challenge you have is as a little company, you're dealing with a big company. Big companies don't like dealing with little companies so much. There's a lot of risk involved. Your balance sheets are weak. And if they're going to develop a whole new multi-billion-dollar product range based on your technology, it's risky for them because you could fall over. So we chose, rather than scale up ourselves, we chose to license our technology to Dow out of the U.S. That was a big deal. Dow spent a lot of money, many tens of millions of dollars, building a facility in South Korea next to Samsung, who were the main customer. Through this period, we were growing rapidly. We IPO'd in London. We actually IPO'd twice, once into the junior exchange, then in 2015, we flipped up to the main FTSE, where you go through the process again. But the technology was successful, really to the point where Samsung ended up not buying from us or Dow, but spent a lot of time reverse engineering what we had done and ended up making the technology or making the materials themselves. And much to our disappointment, because we and Dow had, in good faith, had built these facilities to supply Samsung and others. And, where we ended up was in 2019, we were in advance at the end of 19, early 20, we were in advanced discussions with Samsung to sell them the company. And we had term sheets in, and then COVID hit, and early 2020 or February 2020, Samsung pulled out. And I remember telling them, saying, look, if you don't buy us, we're going to sue you for patent infringement. They pulled out. And on Valentine's Day, February 14, 2020, we sued them in the Eastern District of Texas for patent infringement. And that, it was a big deal. These lawsuits are very expensive. They knew we didn't have the money on our own balance sheet. I went out and raised some specialty litigation finance out of Chicago, a specialist firm there. And that case really took it, 4 years before it was resolved. And it resolved 8 hours before we went to court. It was settled, and they ended up writing us a check for $150 million.
It's incredible.
Which, sounds like a lot of money. It is a lot of money, but we would have made a lot more money if we had done business. And, $150 million to Samsung is a bit of a speeding ticket, right?
Yep. And
they now have a multi-billion-dollar, the whole QLED TV range is based on the Nanoco quantum dot technology. But so Mike, really after the lawsuit, I stayed. I stepped down at the end of 2020. I stepped down as CEO of Nanoco and stepped off the board. Stayed on as a special advisor to see that lawsuit through, my baby through to the end. And then once that was settled, I left Nanoco fully. In early 21. I took over at a next generation solid state lithium ion battery company based in Boston called Ionic Materials, which was a Kleiner Perkins funded John self-funded entity. It was a bit of an exciting ride, which we ended up selling part, closing the other part down in middle of last year, June, where are we? June 24, and then joined Polar in November 24. That's where I am now.
So when you look at this lesson, I mean, Nanoco, you're going through a partnership that works with a promise to make sure people get paid and that there's a place to do the science. When you look at your partner, they are the individual driving the science and you're driving all the other elements of the business. It must have been something special to get that kind of traction. And you must have seen, okay, this technology has application. How does it go from that moment of like, this has application somewhere to suddenly being utilized by Samsung? How does that journey happen? And how do you actually get the connections going to create that opportunity?
A lot of hard work and a lot of shoe leather and really getting out into the market and talking to as many companies who might be interested as possible and really listening hard and learning from them. These companies all have tremendously smart people who really understand the potential applications much better than you do. So being able to get in there, learn from them, present as much data as possible, being as data-driven as possible. So you're actually bringing information, bringing facts to them, listening and exploring possible ways that these can be used is the way we did it. And we really traveled very hard. I was in Japan probably 2 weeks a month for a couple of years and just going around and listening and getting material into the hands of these people and seeing how we can improve and see how it can work. But it was really very much around getting out into the market. You can't do it from your office.
So when I talk to you about where you are now with Polar Performance Materials, this feels like something that's the next step in terms of leveraging all those skills that you just talked about. So what is this business that you're in right now and what is its opportunity? And because I got to believe that it's borrowing from each of these moments.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be at Polar. It was unexpected. I wasn't specifically looking for another, full operator role, but the business I joined because the business has tremendous potential. It's in an area that I know well, semiconductor materials, and we bring something that's unique. So we have this white powder, this alumina, which goes in to make ceramic parts, which go into the tools to make high-end or advanced node semiconductor chips. So we were effectively a tier 3 supplier to someone like TSMC or Samsung. So we supply to a ceramic part maker who then supplies to Lam Research, AMAT, Applied Materials, that is Tokyo Electron, who then build our material and parts into their tools, which then get sold, these etch and deposition tools, to TSMC, Samsung, Intel, Micron, and others. And it's really data-driven selling, technical selling. But my first 6 months in the company was really around restructuring Polar, building the base out of Polar, whether it's head of HR, who you know well, Joe, Marietta, new head of finance, head of quality. With that in place now, it's allowed me to become much more externally focused. So I'm now working closely with our sales execs, and we've got 2 folks in the US who are very, very technical. We have a full-time person in Japan and another one in Korea, and we're hiring now in Taiwan. And really, because I'm spending a lot more time out in the market talking to all the big current and potential customers and seeing how we can do deals. And it's exciting. People like the product. And we're in the process of doing advanced engineering on creating a new factory, which is 4 times the size, which we hope to bring online the second half of 27. The future is very bright, and I'm excited. I'm having a ton of fun. I love the people I'm working with, which is half of it. We laugh a lot, and that's when you're building something and you enjoy working with the folks, it just doesn't feel like work. It's fun.
What did you see? Because you looked at the business and you saw that there was something special there. And was it the science at that point? Was it just understanding a market and the opportunity presented by what Polar could produce?
Yeah, I think it was an understanding that they had a unique way of producing alumina, very different from everyone else in the world, where they make this ultra high purity, what we would call 5N. 5N is 99.999% pure. And they make that out of the gate, where other people make less pure alumina and then clean it up. If we want to get into less pure, we have to make ours dirty. So that was one really interesting. The other interesting sort of more macro trend is, chips, semiconductors continue to advance. The performance continues to go up, and that's really driven by, the line width on silicon, and we're now down to, commercially down to 1.8 nanometers. TSMC is now working at 1.4 nanometers. That's 18 angstroms, 14 angstroms. That's 18 atoms wide. The macro trend, as you get to higher performance chips, more advanced node, is that every material going in needs to be purer and purer. So my feeling was that having something that was hugely pure my gut again said that this was going to be very beneficial, was trending in the same direction as the industry. What's turned out is that in addition to purity, there's a number of other significant benefits that our material has to the industry that we're, again, just discovering. So by going and talking to the customers and listening to the customers and hearing how they're using our product, in a lot of ways, they're teaching us. And that's really important to be open to that. So, we're at the beginning of the journey. We're scaling and growing rapidly. We're now about 70 people. And it's exciting. I'm traveling a lot, maybe more than, I would hope, but, that will settle down. And we have a head office up in Oakville, Ontario. And I love going up there because it's hanging out with some really cool people.
So I look at people that are performers and they have these inputs that keep them sane. What are the things that keep you sane in your life? What do you need to do all the time? What keeps you happy and focused?
One guess as you look over my left shoulder.
Skiing.
I'm obsessed with skiing. Skiing keeps me sane. I ski in the winter. The winter season is far too short for me, so I'm a lifelong skier. I ski as much as I can in the winter. I'm also a lifelong sailor, but I've sort of hung up the sailing in favor of skiing, and I'm anxiously awaiting end of October, early November when we can get back out there. But that really does keep me sane, and then I spend a lot of time staying in shape so I can ski without getting injured.
It's interesting what you're talking about there is something that people don't do enough of. And I mean, you're hearing more about prehab as opposed to rehab, right? Like you don't if you prehabilitate, you actually structure your body so that it can take the pounding. And as you age, like I'm going through it, more and more of it becomes about prehab so that you can avoid the rehab afterwards.
Well, it's absolutely right, Joe. And if you look, at any of the professional athletes in whatever sport, what you don't see when you're watching them compete or play is the amount of, in your terms, I had never heard the prehab word before, but it's a good word. The amount of work that they put in, the amount of off-season work they put in to prepare their body for, whether it's a 1 minute slalom race or a WNBA basketball game, it's tremendous, and we all watch it, and then we think, oh, we can just go out and do it, and we get hurt. And so keeping in shape and strengthening what needs to be strengthened does prevent you from getting injured.
I remember I was actually exercising in the condo gym that I lived in, and there was a CEO who I'd seen there a few times, and knowing that he had had a couple of successful exits of software companies, he had a trainer there and he was bringing his team in to train them in the condo building with him all the time. And I'm like, why do you do this? And he said, it saved my life. He said, literally, it saved my life because of how much I was working and how imbalanced I was. It's a young guy, like probably, I would guess 35.
Oh, wow.
And he said, without this, I would struggle to function now. And I think it's just becoming more people call it the corporate athlete sometimes, which I think is a bad term. It's like just trying to find the inputs that keep you going really well and making sure that you get them, especially when you have the kind of schedule that you have.
Well, I think there's another factor as well, which is people who are CEOs, people who are driven to do stuff, like yourself, Joe, are, probably have in some way addictive personalities, which allow you to work beyond normal working practices. Putting in 60, 70, 80-hour weeks is not unusual and not something you think is strange. but it is strange to a lot of people. And that is, that requires sort of a weird mental thing. And in my case, I can get addicted to work, and where I love it, I like doing it, but I can do it all the time, to the point where I'm traveling around Asia and think, oh, it's perfect. I can't sleep, so I can almost work 24 hours a day. This is great. But that's warped thinking. And what exercise does is allows you to, sort of recenter yourself a little bit and rechannel yourself. At least it does for me.
It does. And I'm gonna ask you one last question and let you go. You obsess about teams as well. The conversations, I mean, you're a very intense person to negotiate with in the best possible way, and you actually look for the win-win, but you obsess about teams. And I'm curious, if you're to take this, you've built these teams repeatedly and you've done it under a lot of pressure, but if you had to distill what you've learned into a principle for building these companies, which are really just teams of teams that last and succeed, what's the principle that you would share?
It's a really good question. And it's, I'm glad you asked, because the team is fundamental to any success. So, I see my job as CEO, say, of Polar, is to build the best possible team. And I do that by hiring people who are a lot better than me and a lot smarter than me into roles that are clearly defined. And then I stay out of their way. And my job is really about knocking down barriers for them and ensuring they have as much road to run as possible. And that's, it works for me, which is, hire people who are way better than you, way smarter than you, and then, don't try and hold them back. Try and let them fly. Let them rip. And it's where the magic happens. And, I remember when I just started Polar, we were going through, when we first met, going through the big reorganization. And in my head, I know what we need to do, but it's only me with two hands. And then Marietta comes in and she just starts ripping. And then all of a sudden it just stuffs, you get that almost that network effect that you get in software. And then you get to a point where now, the company, I don't need to be involved in the day-to-day minutiae of company operations. I can now focus on investors, on major customers, and moving us forward. But the team, all of my success is based on team. And I often call myself the chief unblocker. My job is to come in and unblock.
Amazing. Michael, this was fun.
All right. Well, I appreciate you inviting me to do this.
All right.
Fun.
All the best.